We come here with no peaceful intent, but ready for battle, determined to avenge our wrongs and set our country free. Let your masters come and attack us. We are ready to meet them, beard to beard. These rousing words were spoken by William Wallace to his men before the Scots faced an English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge on the 11th of September 1297. The Scottish army, whilst strong, were outnumbered by the English, but they did have one advantage on that day. The King of England, Edward I, was absent in France. By 1295, Edward was at war with both Scotland and France, as England's two most ancient enemies formed the Old Alliance against the formidable English king. And Wallace took full advantage of Edward's absence by inflicting a heavy defeat on the English, who were led by John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey. Whilst de Warenne was unquestionably a capable soldier, over the course of his career he had demonstrated on occasions a doubtful stomach for the fight. The year before Stirling Bridge, de Warenne had been appointed as Guardian of Scotland by Edward I, now fully invested in interfering in Scottish affairs, with the king telling de Warenne, "When you get rid of a turd, you do a good job." But de Warenne didn't particularly fancy the post and attempted to resign, citing the bad Scottish weather, claiming it was bad for his health. With the Scots, led by Wallace, breaking into rebellion against the oppressive English, and Edward with his hands full elsewhere, de Warenne was ordered to march north once more and quash the revolt. It is therefore perhaps not a surprise that the English failed to defeat at Stirling Bridge, with de Warenne forced to flee to Berwick. Famously, it was recorded that Wallace took the skin off a fallen English commander taken from the head to the heel to make therewith a baldric for his sword. This was a fairly clear message from Wallace, who was now declared to be the new guardian of Scotland. Despite the reversal, Edward I would not leave Scotland alone, and indeed the final 10 years of his reign became dominated by regular Scottish campaigns, made possible by Edward eventually settling his dispute with King Philip IV of France. And the year after Stirling Bridge, Edward defeated Wallace and the Scots at Falkirk. The following is an account written by an English bishop describing the Battle of Falkirk. There came tidings unto the Lord the King, where he was staying, 6 leagues beyond Edinburgh, that the Scots were approaching directly towards him. As soon as he had heard this, Edward moved with his host towards the parts where the Scots were, and on the morrow the king arrived in good time, and found his enemies prepared to give battle. And so they engaged, and by the grace of God his enemies were soon discomfited and fled. But nevertheless there were slain of the enemy in the day's fight 200 men at arms, and 20,000 of their foot soldiers. Notwithstanding the bishop's massive exaggeration of Scottish casualties, it was an important and symbolic victory for Edward I, as he reminded Wallace and his supporters who was boss. Wallace's defiance had certainly got under the skin of the English king, and this was made plain by the horrific nature of Wallace's execution in 1305. Having been captured and put on trial at Westminster, Wallace remained defiant to the very last. He spoke bluntly in his own defence, knowing that he could expect no mercy whatever he said. "I cannot be a traitor, for I owe him, Edward I, no allegiance. He is not my sovereign, he never received my homage, and whilst life is in this persecuted body, he shall never receive it." Wallace's bravery in the face of Edward's oppression was obvious, and it is little wonder why his story endures to this day, and why he remains a national hero in Scotland. But for Edward, having battered the Welsh into submission, the Scottish defiance had been entirely unacceptable, as he sought to gain control of the whole island of Britain. Over 2 decades earlier, Edward had sent a Welsh prince, Dafydd ap Griffith, to die a most shocking death. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Dafydd's execution wasn't quite entirely unique, but it was near enough, and it would have been profoundly shocking to medieval onlookers, even those used to violence. The Welsh had been a persistent problem to Edward, and he had reserved a violent punishment for one of their leaders. Now the time had come to use that same punishment on William Wallace. Wallace was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Smithfield on the 23rd of August, 1305. An English medieval chronicler wrote of Wallace: "A certain Scot, by name William Wallace, an outcast from pity, a robber, a sacrilegious man, an incendiary, and a homicide, a man more cruel than the cruelty of Herod, and more insane than the fury of Nero." Comparisons to Nero and Herod were fairly common in medieval chronicles when the author was hostile to his subject, and naturally an English chronicler was going to view William Wallace with hostility. The anonymous author continued: "Wallace was a man who burnt alive boys in schools and churches in great numbers, who, when he had collected an army of Scots at the battle of Falkirk against the King of England, and had seen that he could not resist the powerful army of the king, said to the Scots, 'Behold, I have brought you into a ring. Now carol and dance as well as you can,' and so fled himself from the battle, leaving his people to be slain by the sword." This was purely a character assassination, an attempt to portray Wallace as not only a bloodthirsty monster, but a man who was, at heart, a coward. However, this English propaganda does not work. The wars of Scottish independence were triggered primarily by Edward I's interference in Scotland, and Wallace was the man who had stood in his way. After Edward I's death, 2 years after Wallace's execution, the Scottish wars took on a different complexion altogether, as Robert the Bruce took advantage of the weakness of Edward's successor to establish Scottish liberty.